Maniac Albert Fish is considered one of America's first officially recognized maniacs. This genteel old man kidnapped, raped, murdered and ate children in the early 20th century. The exact number of his victims has not been determined to this day. I have always wanted to hurt others, and to make others hurt me. Albert Fish, the future maniac and cannibal. Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870. His father, Randall Fish, a fertilizer merchant, was 75 years old that year. He was 43 years older than Albert's mother. The maniac had 2 siblings, but he was the youngest. Much later, psychiatrists and researchers would argue that all members of the Fish family suffered from various mental disorders. Most likely, putting absentee diagnoses, scientists tried to find the most realistic from their point of view explanation of what turns an ordinary person into a bloody monster. In any case, reliable evidence of mental deviations of Fish was not presented. At birth, the future maniac was named Hamilton. When he was 5 years old, his father Randall Fish died on the street from a heart attack. The Fishes had no special savings, and Hamilton's mother was forced to give him to an orphanage. There he got a nickname that matched his name. He couldn't get rid of it for a long time. That's why he disliked the name given to him at birth. It was also in the orphanage that Fish realized he enjoyed pain. In those days, many orphanages in America practiced physical punishment in the form of flogging. During the punishments, and later the manhandling, little Fish would get an erection. For an 8-year-old boy, this is unusual and served as an additional incentive to bully Fish. 4 years later, in 1879, Albert's mother was able to get a civil service job and took her son. But the orphanage experience changed the future monster forever. He was only 12 years old when he had a same-sex affair with a letter carrier boy delivering telegrams. Around the same time, Fish began to visit public baths, where he could freely view men without clothes. He was particularly attracted to boys, ages 7 to 12. In 1890, Fish moved to New York City. Immediately after the move, he changed his hated name Hamilton to Albert. He later said he moved to become a prostitute. Whether he realized his plans is unknown. But the fact that after his arrival, he began to regularly force young boys into the act has been established. Maniac chose his victims among the homeless, which in those days on the streets of New York was very much. They did not seek to report to the police, and therefore the police did not know about Fish's artistry. However, Albert's mother suspected something and decided to urgently marry her son. In 1898, Albert married a 19-year-old girl, who picked up his mother. From this marriage Fish had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 girls. But he continued to prey on children. In 1903, the maniac was caught stealing from a warehouse, where he worked as a loader or storekeeper. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and sent to the famous Sing Sing prison. In prison, Albert was quite popular. In those days, men with unconventional views still tried not to advertise their passions. So hardened inmates, who hadn't seen a woman in decades, had to use weaker inmates. And there was no need to force. Albert was always in favor. After leaving prison in 1905, Fish was quiet for a while. Or maybe not quiet. In those days there was no global informatization, and therefore about some crimes, no one ever found out. His first deprivation of life, which is imputed to Fish, he committed in 1910. The victim was Thomas Bedden of Delaware, who was 10 years old. The next massacre occurred 9 years later. Fish, according to police, took the life with a knife mentally retarded boy in the state of Virginia. The monster committed a new crime 5 years later. On July 14, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonald disappeared. The boy's friends reported that he left with an elderly thin man with a gray mustache. The police set out to find the gray man, one of Fish's nicknames given to him by the police for the color of his cape. But in those days the police had no experience in investigating such unmotivated crimes. And the investigation went nowhere. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney disappeared. The abduction was witnessed by Gaffney's 3-year-old friend, also Billy. He said that a strange man approached them as they were playing near the house. Why strange? He was so fabulous, not scary at all, the boy said. And the witness also described the gray mustache of the criminal, which he even allowed to touch. Undoubtedly, today's policemen would have clung to the gray mustache and would have been able to connect these details. But the experience of the police of that time was telling. The most famous kidnapping and deprivation of life maniac committed in June 1928. Edward Budd, 18, placed an ad in a newspaper looking for a job in a rural area and gave his address. That's where 58-year-old Fish went. It's possible he wanted to kidnap the young man. However, when he arrived, he saw Edward's 10-year-old sister Grace. And his plans changed. He spent a few hours at the Budd's house, promised to hire Edward, and left. He returned, as promised, a couple days later. He told Edward to pack his things, and he'd come back for him later. And while Edward was packing Fish, he introduced himself as Frank Howard, the farmer, and convinced Grace's parents to let her go to the party with him. His niece, who lives not too far away, is having a birthday party. The trusting buddies let the girl go and never saw her again. By the way, 2 years after Grace's disappearance, the police arrested a certain Charles Edward Pope. It was his wife who informed the police that it was he who had kidnapped the girl. Pope was put behind bars for 4 months. But at the trial, his guilt was not proven. But it turned out that Pope was going to divorce his wife and even moved out of their apartment. A woman's revenge? And 6.5 years after Grace's disappearance, in November 1934, her mother Delia received an anonymous letter. This letter, sent by a maniac, became the most famous of all the criminal's messages. 2 shocking details were given by the executioner in his message. This is what was written in the letter: "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894 my friend sailed as a sailor on the steamer Tacoma under the command of Captain John Davis. From San Francisco they sailed to Hong Kong, China. Upon arrival, my friend and 2 other sailors went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the ship had already left. At that time there was a famine in China. Meat of any variety cost from $1 to $3 a pound. Since it was the poor who suffered most, all children under 12 years of age were sold for food to save their elders from starvation. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe on the street. You could walk into any store and ask for a steak, and you would be cooked meat. You would be provided with pieces of a boy's or girl's if you only wished for a tenderloin of such meat. The blood of the boy or girl is the most precious part of the body. It was sold at the highest price. A friend who lingered there acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he captured 2 boys, ages 7 and 11. Hiding them in his remote home, he kept them tied up in the toilet. Several times a day he spanked them to make them taste better. The first one he took the life of was an 11-year-old boy because he was fatter and had more meat. More meat. The smaller boy repeated the same way. I was living at 409 East 100th Street at the time. A friend had told me so often about the taste of human flesh that I decided to try it to form my own opinion. On Sunday, June 3, 1928, I went to your address at 406 West 15th Street. I brought you a basket of strawberries. We had breakfast. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I decided to eat her. I offered to take her to the feast. You said, yes, she can go. I led her to an empty house in Westchester that I had picked out in advance. When we got there, I told her to stay outside. She was picking wild flowers. I went upstairs and took off all my clothes. I knew that if I started doing what I intended to do, I would get her blood all over me. When everything was ready, I went to the window and called out to her. I then hid in the bathroom until she came into the room. When she saw me with no clothes on, she screamed and tried to run to the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she was going to tell her mom about everything. First I took off all her clothes. How she kicked her legs, biting and tearing. I strangled her and then cut out the soft parts to take to my rooms. Cook and eat. It took me 9 days to completely eat. I did not use her for sexual purposes, although I could if I wanted to. The maniac later told his lawyer that he did take advantage of Grace. But the police did not confirm this statement. In general, as noted by psychiatrists, Fish was just a pathological liar. Grace's parents didn't believe in the reality of what the maniac described. They thought someone had played a stupid and terrible joke on them. But the letter was delivered to the police and found its way into the hands of the chief investigator William King. And the policeman didn't think it was a prank. He also noticed that the letter was sealed in a branded envelope. But the envelope clearly recognized the hexagonal emblem of the New York Private Drivers Benevolent Association. Such envelopes were not produced in the millions, but in small batches. King ordered that all employees of the organization be thoroughly questioned about the misuse of the envelopes. The doorman admitted that he had taken some envelopes for his own use. However, he did not have time to use them all. He had left some of them in a room he had recently moved out of. The owner of the room said that after this doorman, the room was rented by an elderly thin man with a gray mustache. She also said that the tenant gets money from his son. Having moved out a few days ago, he hadn't received the last transfer. He's supposed to come for it. King decided to meet the suspicious grandfather himself. In those days, there was no SWAT team, and police officers were sometimes sent alone to arrest criminals. That's what King did. Albert Fish, as soon as the investigator introduced himself and offered to go with him, pounced on King with 2 dangerous razors in his hands. But the policeman wrestled the maniac to the ground and took him back to headquarters. There the monster immediately confessed to taking Grace's life, and the girl's mother and brother recognized him. But the police decided to check Fish for other disappearances. His picture was published in the newspaper, and soon the police were approached by a trolleybus controller who identified Fish as the man who had ridden in his vehicle with a little boy on February 11, 1927. The witness stated that he remembered the strange couple because the boy was without a jacket, crying and constantly calling for his mother. That was the day Bill Gaffney disappeared, whose body was never found. The boy's mother went directly to the maniac and asked him to tell about her son, and Fish told everything as it was. He told how he abused him and how he ate him for 4 days. After Grace's mother's letter, most psychiatrists began to declare that Albert Fish was insane and could not be tried. Apparently, this verdict is what the maniac sought, which described his exploits. And the criminal also claimed to have a deep faith in God. And even when he ate his victims and drank their blood, he was just performing a ritual. But although psychiatrists were inclined to think that he was insane, Fish was still brought before a jury. It may well have been a political decision. Either way, the trial began on March 11, 1935, and Fish was found to have been responsible for 3 deaths. The police accused him of 15, and the perpetrator himself confessed to 498. The trial ended 10 days later with a death sentence. Upon hearing it, the maniac exclaimed, "What a delight to die in the electric chair. It will be the ultimate pleasure, the only one I have never experienced before." He was indeed a masochist and did not exaggerate his pleasure in pain. When Albert Fish was chained to the electric chair on January 16, 1936, in the prison he already knew. At Sing Sing prison, they couldn't get the current through his body straight away. The switch had to be turned on twice before the doctor pronounced him dead. The cause was discovered at the autopsy. It turned out that Fish himself in his body drove several dozen needles. 27 of them were found in the groin area alone. In the groin alone, this metal had interfered with the normal flow of electric current. But the same metal also caused Fish unbearable suffering. It seems that the maniac got a lot of pleasure from the double execution.